interrupt ABC World News to take you live now to Sydney, the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen. Let's take a listen.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I wanted to make a few brief remarks. Of course, we saw yesterday the Leader of the Opposition meet with President Yudhoyono. It's quite apparent that the Leader of the Opposition did not raise the matter of turning back the boats with President Yudhoyono. This is a very significant failure by Tony Abbott. He said he believes in a policy of no surprises when it comes to relations with Indonesia. Well, the only surprise is that he didn't bother to raise the issue of turning back the boats with the President of Indonesia. Now, Tony Abbott has taken many various policy positions here. He said that he'll turn back the boats regardless of what Indonesia says. And then he says he'll workshop everything with Indonesia, but he didn't bother to workshop what is, he says, the centrepiece of his policy with the President of Indonesia. Now, this is just clearly unacceptable. Tony Abbott is normally all talk when it comes to asylum seekers. Now he's not even that. He didn't even talk to the President of Indonesia about this centrepiece of his policy. Now, it's quite clear why he didn't. He didn't because he didn't want it known that the President of Indonesia had said no. The government of Indonesia has made it crystal clear what they think about this policy. They've made it crystal clear that they will not cooperate with the policy, and yet Tony Abbott didn't even raise it with the President of Indonesia because he wouldn't like the answer. Now, I see Mr Morrison saying that he's had private discussions with Mr Nadler and he's not going to reveal what was in them. Well, that's unusually retiring for Mr Morrison. It's not like the Liberal Party not to shout from the rooftops their views about these issues. They've engaged in megaphone diplomacy on this issue now for months and months. They've said that this is Indonesia's problem, Indonesia boats disgorging people, Indonesian flag vessels disgorging people on Australian shores. So I think this underlines that this turn back the boat policy lies in tatters. This turn back the boat policy lies in tatters because Tony Abbott didn't even have the guts to raise it with President Yudhoyono. Happy to take questions.
Minister, we've seen 4,500 boats arrive since Labor brought back offshore processing. Does that show that your policy is the one that really isn't working?
Well, very clearly we need to implement every recommendation of the Houston report. Very clearly that will take time to work. Very clearly we've said for some time, for example, that the key to deterring boat arrivals would be the implementation of the Malaysia Agreement. So it's quite unusual to see Mr Abbott and Mr Morrison jumping up and down saying, oh look, Nauru and Manus Island aren't working. Well, we are implementing Nauru and Manus Island, but we're also implementing all of the recommendations of the panel, and I'll be providing regular updates on that, as I have done up to this point.
But the nation's most senior judges knocked back the Malaysian idea in the High Court.
The High Court interpreted the Migration Act, and we've since amended the Migration Act.
Minister, you say Tony Abbott should have raised this toe-back policy with the Indonesian President, but it was raised by Scott Morrison with the Indonesian Foreign Minister. What's the difference?
Well, Mr Abbott is the alternative Prime Minister. Mr Yudhoyono is the President of Indonesia. It is a complete cop-out for Mr Abbott not to raise what he says is the centrepiece of his policy. And then Mr Morrison says he had a private meeting with Mr Nadler. Well, it's simply not good enough to say, well, Tony Abbott didn't raise it with Mr Yudhoyono, but I raised it with Mr Nadler, but I'm not going to tell you what I said or what he said. That is simply a cop-out.
When does the government plan to start processing the 4,600 asylum seekers that have arrived?
Well, look, our policies are being very clearly implemented. We've had a number of transfers to Nauru and Manus Island, and we have well progressed the establishment of Manus Island. I'll be providing further updates on progress in terms of all the recommendations and how we're handling the situation in due course.
Is this purely for domestic consumption, this policy?
Absolutely, absolutely. He talks tough in Canberra, but doesn't talk at all in Jakarta. He's a lion in Canberra and a mouse in Indonesia. He is simply not willing to try and talk to the President of Indonesia about this policy, which he beats his chest about whenever he's got TV cameras in front of him in Australia, but won't even raise with the people who are the key to making it work.
Mr Bowen, given that the number of asylum seekers that have arrived since mid-August is about double the capacity of the new processing areas that you've set up in Manus Island and Nauru, does the government accept that some of those people will be processed in Australia?
Well, the law is that people who arrive in Australia by boat are then transferred to offshore processing places. That is the law as it stands. Now, of course, well, as I say, I freely acknowledge there are, of course, real challenges in terms of implementing all the policies with the numbers of arrivals, and I would make further statements about that in due course. But let's be very clear. Those people smugglers who are out there saying, don't worry about it, you won't be sent to Nauru, are wrong. The law is very clear, and we will be implementing the law in relation to offshore processing and regular transfers to offshore processing countries.
Minister, the government has announced plans for an independent review system to look at cases where ASIO has found asylum seekers were a security threat. Is Australia lagging behind a lot of other countries like the UK?
No, I think this is a good development which I support, and I've worked very closely with the Attorney-General on, and I certainly welcome her announcement. I think very clearly national security always comes first, but we also need to ensure that people who are having decisions made about them have an opportunity to put their case and to put their case in a review. And I think this is a good development which will see these cases being dealt with in a very considered way, which is an appropriate way, which the Attorney-General and I, and particularly the Attorney-General, have been working on for some time.
The opposition are planning to go to Sri Lanka to hold meetings with government representatives. Is another clear indication that the foreign governments are taking the opposition seriously?
Oh no, look, it's very common for shadow ministers and leaders of the opposition to visit other countries and to be treated with courtesy and respect. But in relation to Sri Lanka, let me say a couple of things. I've been to Sri Lanka, I've met with very senior Sri Lankan government officials, and we have good cooperation with them. But they are going to talk to Sri Lanka about implementing their turn back the boats policy to Sri Lanka, one they didn't bother to raise with the head of the Indonesian government. Secondly, their policy is to turn back boats to Sri Lanka, which is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. So they say it's okay to turn back boats to Sri Lanka, which is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. It's okay to turn back boats to Indonesia, which is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but we couldn't possibly approve an agreement with Malaysia where there are protections negotiated and written down because it's not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. And in relation to Sri Lanka, they are returning people directly to the country that they're leaving, which is a clear breach of the Refugee Convention. There is no way of arguing otherwise. And for them to then use the Refugee Convention as an excuse for opposing the implementation of the Malaysia Agreement shows how hypocritical their position has become.
But what firm guarantees, though, have you got from the Malaysian government that asylum seekers would be treated humanely there?
Well, we've been around this track a few times. With respect, we have an agreement in writing with the Malaysian government in relation to non-refoulement, the fundamental principle of the Refugee Convention, and people being treated with dignity and respect. Much more, where's the agreement with Indonesia? Where's the agreement with Sri Lanka that the opposition has negotiated that they say would allow them to turn back boats?
Given that there's been no real slowdown in the number of boats arriving since the Manus Island and Nauru sort of policies have been announced, when do you expect that the public can see results of the offshore processing policy?
Well, look, obviously we are working to implement this policy. It takes time to work, no question about that. I'm not going to provide sort of a regular running commentary on what we see in intelligence reports or what we're seeing in terms of the impact, other than to say I think it is clearly being noticed around the region, but we are in a real battle with people smugglers who are saying that this policy won't be implemented, you won't be taken to Nauru. If you're taken to Nauru, you'll only be there for a short time. That is a challenge for us in terms of communicating the government's resolve. But it is not a challenge that we'll be walking away from.
Minister, the Refugee and Migration Review Tribunal says its caseload has jumped by more than 50% in the first 3 months of the financial year. Does the tribunal need more government funding to be able to do its job effectively?
Well, we've increased the resources to the tribunals, and we've increased the number of tribunal members quite substantially over the last few years. I meet regularly with the head of tribunal and talk to her about the challenges. There has been an increase which goes to a whole range of issues, including students then appealing migration decisions when their student visa has run out, etc. I believe, obviously, we're working closely with the new chair who I've appointed, the new principal member of the Migration and Refugee Tribunals, on all those questions. I appointed, of course, the Honourable Michael Lavache to review work processes and resourcing issues. He didn't recommend any substantial increase in resourcing, so we are implementing the Lavache recommendations, but I continue to talk to the principal member about all those issues. Last question.
Why has the government appointed G4S, the same company that watched Olympic security in London, to run Manus Island?
We are in process of talking to a range of companies about a range of service provisions in Nauru and Manus Island. It's well known, we've got a letter of intent with one particular provider. We have a particularly strong contract management regime in place for those to ensure that the services that we require to be delivered would be delivered. When we've signed a contract, then I'll say further about that at that point. Thank you very much.